Curtis Malone knelt in the mud, his weathered hands trembling as they moved over Dakota's injured leg. The once majestic Mustang lay on his side, eyes wide with pain and fear. "He needs to be put down," the other men murmured. "No vet can fix that." But Curtis knew better. 20 years had passed since he'd practiced veterinary medicine. 20 years since the accident that took his brother's life, and Curtis's will to heal rain poured down as Meredith Fuller clutched her daughter Ruby's shoulders. Tears streaming down both their faces, Curtis looked up, his decision made. "I can help him." He said words that would change everything. 4 days later, a convoy of black SUVs rumbled down the dirt road toward Curtis's isolated farm. The lead vehicle stopped in Preston Wellington, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, and the man who had once sworn Curtis would never touch another horse stepped out. What happened next left everyone in Red Rock speechless. Nobody could have imagined that saving Dakota's leg would lead to a gift that would transform not just Curtis's life, but the lives of countless animals across the state. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other on Curtis Malone's modest farm on the outskirts of Red Rock. Dawn broke over the rolling hills, casting long shadows across fields that had seen better days. Curtis moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had lived alone for 2 decades, his routine as familiar as the lines etched into his weathered face. He poured coffee into a chipped mug, the same one he'd used since moving to this isolated patch of land through the kitchen window. He watched his 2 border collies chasing each other through the tall grass. The farm was quiet. Too quiet for what it once was, where there had once been the sounds of livestock and busy hands. Now there was just Curtis, his dogs, and the occasional stray animal he'd taken nursed back to health and released. The phone rarely rang anymore. Most folks in Red Rock had forgotten about Curtis Malone, or worse, remembered only the whispered stories of the talented young veterinarian who'd left practice after his brother died in his care. The man who'd once been called a miracle worker, with animals, now fixed tractors and tended a small vegetable garden. His skilled hands relegated to simple tasks. Curtis finished his coffee and was heading to repair a broken fence when he heard it. The unmistakable sound of tires struggling up his muddy driveway. He squinted against the morning sun, surprised to see a battered pickup truck pulling a horse trailer. It had been years since anyone had brought an animal to him. The truck lurched to a stop, and a woman jumped out, her movements frantic. She was in her mid-30s, with auburn hair hastily pulled back, worry lines creasing her forehead. A young girl followed, no more than 12, her eyes red from crying. "Are you Curtis Malone?" The woman called out, her voice strained. Curtis nodded, approaching cautiously. I'm Meredith Fuller. This is my daughter, Ruby." She gestured to the girl who stood close to her side. "We need help, a horse." A pained whinny from the trailer finished her sentence. Curtis's body tensed, old instincts rising to the surface. "Please." Ruby spoke up, her voice small but determined. "Dakota's hurt. Real bad. Dr. Chapman says he needs to be put down. But Mom says you might help." Curtis felt a knot form in his stomach. "I don't practice anymore. I know," Meredith said quickly. "Everyone in town knows, but Mrs. Miller at the feed store said you still have a way with animals. Said you fixed her son's calf when no one else could." Her eyes were pleading. "We can't afford the surgery. Dr. Chapman talked about, but we can't just..." Her voice broke. Curtis stood, frozen memories flooding back. The gleaming veterinary clinic he'd once run, the animals he'd saved, and the one human he couldn't. Joe's face flashed in his mind, and with it came the familiar wave of guilt. "I'm sorry," he muttered, turning away. "Dr. Chapman's office is the best place for your horse. We just came from there," Meredith said, desperation edging into her voice. "He says the break is too complex, that saving the leg would cost thousands. We don't have the only other option is to put him down." Ruby stepped forward, then her small hand reaching out to touch Curtis's arm. "Dakota's special Mr. Malone. He was wild. When we found him, everyone said he couldn't be tamed, but he trusted me. Please just look at him. Please, something." The girl's eyes, a mix of hope and determination, stopped Curtis from walking away with a deep sigh. He nodded. "I'll take a look, that's all I'm promising." Relief washed over both their faces as Curtis approached the trailer inside. A magnificent Mustang lay on his side, his coat slick with sweat. One front leg was grotesquely swollen, the angle all wrong. The horse's eyes rolled wildly as Curtis climbed into the trailer. "Hey there, boy," Curtis murmured, his voice automatically falling into the soothing cadence he'd used with frightened animals for years. "Easy now." Remarkably, the horse calmed at his voice. Curtis ran his hands gently along the injured leg, feeling the break beneath his fingers. It was bad, a complex fracture that would indeed require extensive surgery pins and months of rehabilitation. Dr. Chapman hadn't been wrong about the prognosis or the cost. Outside, thunder rumbled as storm clouds gathered. Curtis hadn't noticed the darkening sky until now. How did this happen? He asked, still examining the leg. "Flash flood hit our property yesterday." Meredith explained. "Dakota was trapped in a gully by the time we found him. His leg was like that. He must have panicked. Tried to climb out on the rocks." Curtis nodded grimly. The damage was consistent with a fall on rough terrain. He continued his assessment, noting the horse's strong vitals despite the injury. "Dakota was a fighter, Mr. Malone," Ruby's voice quavered. "Can you help him?" Curtis looked up, meeting the girl's desperate gaze. He should say no. He should direct them back to Dr. Chapman or suggest they contact the equine specialist in the next county. He'd left that life behind for good reasons, but the horse nudged his hand as if making his own plea. And suddenly Curtis was transported back to his first days as a vet when helping animals. Had been everything to him. Rain began to fall light at first, then heavier. Curtis heard Meredith tell Ruby to get in the truck to stay dry. He remained with Dakota, stroking his neck, thinking, "Come on, boy," he whispered. "You want to fight, don't you?" Dakota's ears flicked toward him, his dark eyes holding Curtis's gaze in that moment. Curtis made his decision. He emerged from the trailer, rain soaking through his flannel shirt, and approached Meredith's window. "I'll need help getting him into my barn," he said simply. Meredith's eyes widened. "You'll try to save him?" "I'm not promising anything," Curtis cautioned, even as part of him wondered what he was doing. "But yes, I'll try." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of activity with Meredith's help. Curtis managed to sedate Dakota enough to transport him from the trailer into the old barn. The space hadn't been used for serious veterinary work in years, but the basics were still there. A clean stall with ample bedding, proper lighting, and the large medical chest Curtis had never quite been able to part with. Ruby watched wide-eyed as Curtis moved around the barn, pulling out equipment he hadn't touched in decades. There was a strange familiarity to it all, his hands remembering what his mind had tried to forget. "Is there anything I can do?" Meredith asked, watching Curtis prepare a splint. "There's a red toolbox in that cabinet," Curtis directed, nodding toward the far wall. "And I'll need hot water as much as you can heat up." As they worked, the rain intensified, drumming against the barn roof. Curtis found himself explaining each step as he went, partly to keep Meredith and Ruby informed, partly because talking through procedures had always been his way. "The fracture is compound, but not as severely displaced as I feared," he noted, cleaning the wound with practiced hands. "I can set it, but he'll need a custom brace there. All challenge will be keeping him from putting weight on it while it heals." "But you think he can heal?" Ruby's voice was small but hopeful. Curtis looked up from his work, weighing his words carefully. "It's possible, not guaranteed, but possible. That's more hope than Dr. Chapman gave us," Meredith said quietly. Curtis frowned, focusing again on Dakota's leg. "Russell is a good vet, but conventional some cases need unconventional approaches." "Is that what got you in trouble before?" Meredith asked, then immediately looked as if she regretted the question. "I'm sorry, that was inappropriate." Curtis's hand stilled for a moment. "No," he said finally. "What got me in trouble was thinking I could control everything, that my skills were enough to overcome anything." He resumed, working his voice growing quieter. "I was wrong." They lapsed into silence as Curtis continued his methodical work outside. The storm grew more intense, lightning occasionally illuminating the barn through the high windows. After an hour, Curtis had managed to clean, set, and splint Dakota's leg as best he could with the materials available. The horse was still sedated but stable. "I'll need to get proper medical supplies," Curtis said, wiping his hands on a towel. "And you should both get home before this storm gets worse." We can't just leave him, Ruby protested. Ruby Meredith said gently. Mr. Malone knows what he's doing. Curtis looked at the girl's anxious face and felt something shift inside him, a long dormant sense of responsibility. You can come back tomorrow, he offered. He'll be sleeping mostly anyway. Promise you'll call if anything changes? Ruby asked. Curtis nodded. I promise. Meredith reached for her purse. How much do we owe you for today? Curtis shook his head. Let's see if this works before we talk about payment. But the supplies you're tying me of what I need for now, Curtis insisted, though it wasn't. Dakota was trapped in a gully by the time we found him. His leg was like that he must have panicked. Tried to climb out on the rocks? Curtis nodded grimly. The damage was consistent with a fall on rough terrain. He continued his assessment, noting the horse's strong vitals despite the injury. Dakota was a fighter, Mr. Malone. Ruby's voice quavered. Can you help him? Curtis looked up, meeting the girl's desperate gaze. He should say no. He should direct them back to Dr. Chapman, or suggest they contact the equine specialist in the next county. He'd left that life behind for good reasons, but the horse nudged his hand as if making his own plea. And suddenly Curtis was transported back to his first days as a vet, when helping animals had been everything. To him, rain began to fall light at first, then heavier. Curtis heard Meredith tell Ruby to get in the truck to stay dry. He remained with Dakota, stroking his neck, thinking, Come on, boy. He whispered, You want to fight, don't you? Dakota's ears flicked toward him, his dark eyes holding Curtis's gaze. In that moment, Curtis made his decision. He emerged from the trailer, rain soaking through his flannel shirt, and approached Meredith's window. I'll need help getting him into my barn, he said simply. Meredith's eyes widened. You'll try to save him? I'm not promising anything, Curtis cautioned, even as part of him wondered what he was doing. But yes, I'll try. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of activity with Meredith's help. Curtis managed to sedate Dakota enough to transport him from the trailer into the old barn. The space hadn't been used for serious veterinary work in years, but the basics were still there. A clean stall with ample bedding, proper lighting, and the large medical chest Curtis had never quite been able to part with. Ruby watched wide-eyed as Curtis moved around the barn, pulling out equipment he hadn't touched in decades. There was a strange familiarity to it all, his hands remembering what his mind had tried to forget. Is there anything I can do? Meredith asked, watching Curtis prepare asplint. There's a red toolbox in that cabinet, Curtis directed, nodding toward the far wall, and I'll need hot water as much as you can heat up. As they worked, the rain intensified, drumming against the barn roof. Curtis found himself explaining each step as he went, partly to keep Meredith and Ruby informed, partly because talking through procedures had always been his way. The fracture is compound, but not as severely displaced as I feared, he noted. Cleaning the wound with practiced hands, I can set it, but he'll need a custom brace there. Our challenge will be keeping him from putting weight on it while it heals. But you think he can heal? Ruby's voice was small but hopeful. Curtis looked up from his work, weighing his words carefully. It's possible, not guaranteed, but possible. That's more hope than Dr. Chapman gave us, Meredith said quietly. Curtis frowned, focusing again on Dakota's leg. Russell is a good vet, but conventional. Some cases need unconventional approaches. Is that what got you in trouble before? Meredith asked, then immediately looked as if she regretted the question. I'm sorry, that was inappropriate. Curtis's hands stilled for a moment. No, he said finally. What got me in trouble was thinking I could control everything, that my skills were enough to overcome anything. He resumed, working his voice, growing quieter. I was wrong. They lapsed into silence as Curtis continued his methodical work outside. The storm grew more intense, lightning occasionally illuminating the barn through the high windows. After an hour, Curtis had managed to clean, set, and splint Dakota's leg as best he could with the materials available. The horse was still sedated but stable. I'll need to get proper medical supplies, Curtis said, wiping his hands on a towel. And you should both get home before this storm gets worse. We can't just leave him, Ruby protested. Ruby Meredith said gently, Mr. Malone knows what he's doing. Curtis looked at the girl's anxious face and felt something shift inside him, a long dormant sense of responsibility. You can come back tomorrow, he offered. He'll be sleeping mostly anyway. Promise you'll call if anything changes? Ruby asked. Curtis nodded. I promise. Meredith reached for her purse. How much do we owe you for today? Curtis shook his head. Let's see if this works before we talk about payment. But the supplies your time I have what I need for now. Curtis insisted, though it wasn't entirely true. He'd need to dip into his meager savings for the proper materials. Go on home now, roads will be bad soon after they left. Curtis pulled an old cot into the barn and settled in beside Dakota's stall. He told himself it was to monitor the horse. But truthfully, something else kept him there. A feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose as night fell. Curtis sat in the dim light of a lantern listening to Dakota's steady breathing, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. 20 years of isolation, of deliberately avoiding anything that reminded him of his former life undone by one injured horse and a desperate little girl. What would you say about this, Joe? Curtis whispered to the empty barn, thinking of his brother. The only answer was the sound of rain and the occasional soft nickering of the sedated horse. But as Curtis, finally, drifted to sleep on the uncomfortable cot, he felt for the first time in decades that he might be exactly where he needed to be. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the barn's weathered boards. Curtis woke with a start, momentarily confused by his surroundings until the events of the previous day came rushing back his back. Highs from the night on the cot, but he ignored the discomfort as he checked on Dakota. The horse was awake, his dark eyes alert. Despite the sedatives, Curtis approached, slowly speaking in low, soothing tones. Morning, big guy, let's see how you're doing. Dakota's vitals were strong, and the swelling hadn't increased overnight. Both good signs the makeshift splint had held, but Curtis knew it was only a temporary solution. He needed specialized equipment, proper medication, and materials he hadn't stocked. In years, the sound of tires on gravel drew his attention through the barn door. Curtis saw Meredith's truck pull up with Ruby, jumping out before it had fully stopped. How is he? The girl called, rushing toward the barn. Better than I expected, Curtis answered honestly. He's a fighter. Meredith followed her daughter at a more measured pace, carrying a thermos and what looked like a bag of food. We brought breakfast, she explained, and coffee, figured you might need it. Curtis accepted the thermos gratefully. Thank you. Ruby had already made her way to Dakota's stall, speaking to the horse in gentle tones. The animal responded, nickering softly when she approached. He recognizes you, Curtis observed. That's good. Familiar faces help with the healing process. What happens now? Meredith asked, her eyes taking in the improvised setup Curtis had managed. Curtis took a sip of coffee before answering. Now comes the hard part. I need to get supplies, proper bracing materials, antibiotics, pain management medication. Without them, infection is the biggest risk. He hesitated. I need to go into town. Meredith caught the reluctance in his voice. When's the last time you went to Red Rock proper? Been a few years. Curtis admitted the truth was he avoided town as much as possible, making only necessary trips to the outskirts for supplies. Main Street, with its memories and judgmental eyes, was something he'd successfully avoided for nearly a decade. I could go for you, Meredith offered. Just tell me what you need. Curtis shook his head. Some of what I need requires a veterinary license. I'll have to go myself. Then we'll watch. Dakota. Ruby chimed in from the stall, where she sat cross-legged near the horse's head, careful not to disturb his injured leg. Won't we, Mom? Meredith nodded. Of course. Take whatever time you need. Curtis felt an unexpected surge of gratitude. It had been a long time since anyone had offered him help without expecting something in return. He quickly wrote down instructions for monitoring Dakota, though he could tell from how Ruby interacted with the horse that she'd plenty of experience with animal care. If anything changes, anything at all, you call me immediately, Curtis instructed, handing Meredith a scrap of paper with his cell phone number. I don't keep it on normally, but I will today after a quick shower and change of clothes. Curtis climbed into his old pickup truck. The drive into town was only 15 minutes, but to Curtis it felt like crossing a vast distance. Each mile brought him closer to a world he deliberately left behind. Main Street looked much the same as he remembered. The hardware store Miller's Feed and Supply, the small diner where locals gathered for gossip as much as for food. As he parked outside the veterinary clinic, he felt eyes on him. A few older residents stopped to stare, nudging each other and whispering. Curtis ignored them, steeling himself for what would likely be an uncomfortable encounter. The bell above the door jingled as he entered the clinic, a sound so familiar it sent a pang through his chest. The young receptionist looked up, her expression neutral. "Can I help you? I need to speak with Dr. Chapman. Is he in? Do you have an appointment?" "No. But it's important. Tell him Curtis Malone is here." The girl's eyes widened slightly at the name, but she picked up the phone after a brief conversation. She nodded toward the back. "He'll see you. Second door on the right." The clinic smelled exactly as Curtis remembered, antiseptic mixed with the unmistakable scent of animals. He walked down the hallway past examination rooms where he'd once worked until he reached Russell Chapman's office. The older veterinarian was seated behind a desk, his white coat impeccable. His expression guarded. "Curtis," he said, not rising. "Been a long time, Russell." Curtis remained standing. "I need supplies." Dr. Chapman raised an eyebrow. "Supplies? I was under the impression you weren't practicing anymore. I'm not. It's for the Fuller horse." Understanding dawned on Chapman's face. "Dakota. So that's where they took him." He leaned back in his chair. "I advised them to put him down. You know, that leg's beyond saving, maybe," Curtis admitted, "but I'm going to try." Chapman studied him for a long moment. "Why, after all these years of staying away from veterinary work? Why this horse?" Curtis didn't have a clear answer, even for himself. The girl asked. "Me to try." Chapman's expression softened slightly. "Ruby's. A special kid reminds me of you, actually." Before he trailed off, then sighed. "What do you need relief?" Washed over Curtis. As he pulled out his list, Chapman reviewed it, his professional curiosity evident. "You're attempting a full reconstruction without surgery." Curtis nodded, using the Anderson method modified for the specific break pattern that's experimental at best. Chapman cautioned, "I've only seen it done successfully a few times and never on a fracture this severe. I've done it before." Curtis replied, "On a thoroughbred with a similar injury back when I was working with Preston Wellington's horses." Chapman's eyebrows rose before the accident. With Joe, Curtis flinched at the direct reference but nodded. "Yes, before." After a moment's hesitation, Chapman stood and moved to a cabinet. "I can provide most of this, but the specialized bracing materials will have to come from the Equine Hospital in Hillsborough. It'll take a day to get them here. I need them sooner." Curtis insisted. "Infection risk increases exponentially after 48 hours. You know that." Chapman paused, then reached for his phone. "I'll call in a favor. No promises, but I might be able to get them by this evening." He began dialing, then covered the receiver. "This doesn't mean I think you're right, Curtis, but that horse deserves a chance, even if it's a slim one." While Chapman made the call, Curtis stepped out into the waiting room. His presence had clearly become the subject of conversation. The receptionist was whispering with a client, both of them stealing glances in his direction. A familiar voice broke through the awkward silence. "Well, I'll be damned." Curtis Malone. Back in civilization, Curtis turned to see Sheriff Gregory Sanders leaning against the doorframe, his badge catching the fluorescent light. "Just getting supplies. Greg not staying?" The sheriff approached, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Heard about the Fuller horse. Word travels fast." He lowered his voice. "You sure about this?" Curtis, "Been a long time since you practiced. Some things you don't forget." Curtis replied simply, like riding a bike. Greg's tone was skeptical. "This isn't changing. The oil in a tractor. You're talking about saving a limb that a practicing vet said couldn't be saved." Curtis felt a flare of the old confidence he'd once been known for. "Russell's a good vet, but he's cautious. Always has been. And you were always the risk taker." Greg remarked, "Sometimes it worked out. Sometimes it didn't." The unspoken reference to Joe hung between them before Curtis could respond. Chapman emerged with a box of supplies and a prescription pad. "I've arranged for the bracing materials to be delivered to your farm by 6 tonight. Therist is here." He handed Curtis the box and a handwritten prescription. "You're still licensed. Technically never revoked it. But Curtis," he hesitated. "Be careful. Don't make promises you can't keep to that family." Curtis accepted the supplies with a nod of thanks as he turned to leave. Chapman added, And Curtis, if you need a second opinion or an extra pair of Handskall pride, isn't worth a horse's life. The drive back to the farm was tense, Curtis's mind racing. With the technical challenges ahead, the Anderson method was complex, requiring precise tension on the bracing system and careful management of inflammation. But it was Dakota's best chance when he arrived. He found Ruby sitting on a stool beside Dakota. Reading aloud from a book, the horse's ears were perked as if genuinely interested in the story. The sight brought an unexpected smile to Curtis's face. "How's our patient?" he asked, setting down the supplies. "He ate a little," Meredith reported from where she was mucking out the far side of the stall, "and he seems less agitated than this morning." Curtis checked Dakota's vitals again, pleased with what he found. The medications will help with pain and prevent infection, but the real work begins when the bracing materials arrive tonight. "Can we stay and help?" Ruby asked eagerly. Curtis hesitated. The procedure would be lengthy and potentially upsetting if complications arose, but having assistance would be valuable, and Ruby's presence seemed to have a calming effect on Dakota. "It'll be late, and there's no guarantee it will work. We don't mind," Meredith said firmly, "and whatever happens, we want to be here." Curtis found himself nodding. "All right then, but I need to know more about Dakota. His age, health history, how long you've had him," as Ruby eagerly provided Dakota's background. Curtis began, preparing the area for the evening's procedure. The horse had been a wild Mustang captured during a Bureau of Land Management roundup. 3 years earlier, most had considered him untamable, but Ruby had connected with him immediately. They were going to send him to auction, Ruby explained, which probably meant the slaughterhouse. Nobody wanted a difficult Mustang, but he wasn't difficult with me. Curtis understood some animals bonded with specific people, forming connections that defied explanation. The bond between Ruby and Dakota was evident in how the horse responded to her voice even through his pain. As the afternoon wore on, Curtis felt rusty medical knowledge coming back, muscle memory returning as he prepared instruments and medications, yet beneath the focused preparation lurked anxiety. It had been 20 years since he'd performed a procedure. This complex 20 years since the day everything went wrong. When Meredith stepped outside to make a phone call, Ruby approached Curtis hesitantly. "Mr. Malone," she said, her voice small, "the kids at school say you stopped being a vet because you made a mistake and someone died." Curtis froze the surgical scissors in his hand. "Suddenly heavy children shouldn't repeat everything they hear," he said carefully, "but was it true?" Ruby persisted. "Is that why you live all alone out here?" Curtis set down the scissors, considering how to answer. This child deserved honesty. "But how much?" "Sometimes," he said finally, "things go wrong. Even when you do everything right, and sometimes it's hard to forgive yourself for that." Ruby seemed to consider this. "If Dakota doesn't get better, will you stop helping animals again?" The question caught Curtis off guard. "I don't know," he admitted, realizing it was true, "but I promise I'll do everything I can for him." Ruby nodded, apparently satisfied. "I believe you." The simple trust in her voice struck Curtis deeply. It had been a long time since anyone had expressed faith in him. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders as he continued preparations, more determined than ever to save Dakota's leg. Not just for the horse or for Ruby, but perhaps for himself as well. As evening approached, the distinctive sound of a delivery truck rumbling up the driveway signaled the arrival of the specialized bracing materials. It was time to begin. The specialized bracing materials arrived in a large box, marked with the logo of the Hillsborough Eco and Hospital. Curtis unwrapped the components with a practiced hand that belied his years away from veterinary work. The Anderson method required a precise external fixation system, a complex framework of metal rods, pins, and connectors that would stabilize the fractured bone while allowing for minimal movement. To prevent muscle atrophy. "Is all that going in his leg?" Ruby asked wide-eyed as Curtis laid out the components not inside. Curtis explained, checking each piece. "This creates a frame around the leg. Think of it like scaffolding around a building under construction. It holds everything in place from the outside while healing happens inside." Meredith watched intently as Curtis explained each component. "How long will it take the procedure?" "I mean several hours if all goes well." Curtis admitted. And that's just the beginning. The recovery will take months with no guarantee of success, but there's a chance. Ruby insisted that's more than Dr. Chapman gave us. Curtis nodded, not wanting to inflate. Their hopes Dakota will need to be sedated again. I'll need help keeping him calm before the medication takes effect. That's my department, Ruby said with quiet confidence as dusk settled. Curtis transformed the simple barn into a makeshift surgical space. Bright work lights illuminated Dakota's stall and sanitized. Instruments lay ready on a clean table. The familiar routine of preparation brought a calmness to Curtis's movements. Ruby sat near Dakota's head, stroking his neck and murmuring reassurances. The horse's trust in the girl was remarkable, even as Curtis, approached with the sedative, Dakota remained calm under Ruby's gentle touch. "That's it, buddy," Ruby whispered. "Mr. Malone's going to make you better, I promise." Curtis administered the sedative, watching as the powerful animal's eyes grew heavy. "He'll be unconscious soon. It might be best if you both wait in the house." "I'm staying," Ruby said. Firmly, Meredith placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Ruby, this is going to be difficult to watch. Maybe we should. He needs me here." Ruby insisted he gets scared when I leave. Curtis understood the girl's devotion, but worried about her witnessing the procedure. "How about a compromise? Stay until he's fully sedated, then wait outside the barn. I'll call you if I need help, and you can come back when he's starting to wake up." Ruby looked ready to protest, but Meredith gave her a firm look that sounds reasonable, right, Ruby? After a moment's hesitation, Ruby nodded reluctantly. "But you promise to call if anything happens, Scout's honor." Curtis replied, surprised at the ease with which he slipped into agentler tone with the child once Dakota was fully sedated. Curtis began the delicate work of cleaning and preparing the damaged leg. The fracture was complex, 3 distinct breaks in the cannon bone. That would have meant certain death for most horses. But Curtis had seen worse during his days working with racing thoroughbreds, and he'd successfully implemented the Anderson method before, as he worked time, seemed to slow down the familiar focus of a challenging procedure, enveloped him, hours passing unnoticed as he meticulously placed each component of the external fixation system. Every pin had to be positioned with absolute precision, the tension perfectly calibrated to support the bone, without restricting blood flow outside the barn. Ruby and Meredith waited. Occasionally, Curtis caught glimpses of the girl peering through the barn door, her face a mixture of worry and hope. He'd expected their presence to be a distraction, but instead found himself drawing strength from their quiet vigil halfway through the procedure when Curtis was setting the most complex part of the fracture. The barn door creaked open. He looked up expecting Ruby, but instead found Dr. Chapman standing in the doorway, medical bag in hand. "Russell," Curtis said, surprise evident in his voice. "What are you doing here?" The older veterinarian approached, studying the work Curtis had already completed. "The Fullers called my office to cancel Dakota's euthanasia appointment," my receptionist mentioned. "The equipment I'd ordered for you." He shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Thought you might want a second pair of hands." Curtis hesitated. Pride urged him to say he had everything under control. But practicality won out. "Could use some help with the medial stabilization while I placed the lateral pins." Chapman nodded, immediately washing up and donning gloves. The 2 men worked in focus. Silence for several minutes before Chapman spoke again. "Your technique hasn't suffered," he observed, adjusting a clamp exactly as Curtis would have instructed. "It's like you never left." Curtis concentrated on placing a particularly tricky pin. "Some things you don't forget. Some things you shouldn't have." To Chapman replied quietly. The weight of unspoken history hung between them. As they continued working 20 years earlier, Chapman had been the senior veterinarian who'd taken Curtis under his wing, mentoring the talented young vet until Curtis had surpassed him, becoming the preferred veterinarian for the wealthy horse owners. In the county, it was Chapman who'd stood by him after Joe's accident, defending Curtis's actions to the review board, and it was Chapman who'd watched him walk away from it all. "I told the Wellington girl about your brother once," Chapman said suddenly. "Angela," she asked, "why someone with your talent disappeared?" Curtis's hand stilled momentarily. "What did you tell her? That sometimes the price of caring too much is unbearably high?" Chapman replied she understood. "She's a good one, that Angela, not like her father." Curtis resumed working, not wanting to discuss Preston Wellington, the memory of their last encounter. Wellington's rage, the accusations, the threat to ruin him remained painfully fresh. Even after 2 decades, as midnight approached, the most critical phase of the procedure was complete. The external fixation system now encased Dakota's leg, holding the broken bone in perfect alignment. "It's good work," Curtis Chapman admitted, inspecting the finished structure textbook application of the Anderson method. "I've never seen it done this." Well, coming from Chapman, it was high praise indeed. We're not out of the woods yet. Curtis cautioned the next 72 hours will determine if infection sets in. And we won't know if the bone is knitting properly for weeks, but you've given him a fighting chance. Chapman said more than I thought possible. He packed his instruments, then paused. "The Fullers can't afford this, you know that, right?" Curtis nodded. "I'm not charging them." Chapman studied him for a moment. "Some things really don't change." He headed for the door, then stopped. "I'll check in tomorrow. Call if you need anything before then." After Chapman left, Curtis completed the bandaging and administered antibiotics and pain medication. It was nearly 2 a.m. when he finally stepped outside, the barn exhaustion settling into his bones. Ruby had fallen asleep on her mother's shoulder, but Meredith was still awake, her eyes questioning as Curtis approached. "It went as well as we could hope," he told her softly. "The next few days will be critical." Relief washed over Meredith's face. "Thank you," she whispered, careful not to wake Ruby. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you." "Let's focus on getting Dakota well first," Curtis replied. "You should take Ruby home, get some sleep. Dakota won't wake up for several hours, and when he does, he'll be heavily medicated." Meredith shook her head. "We promised Ruby we'd be here when he wakes up. We'll sleep in the truck if we need to." Curtis found himself offering without hesitation, "The house has a spare room. It's nothing fancy, but it's better than your truck." The surprise on Meredith's face reminded Curtis how long it had been since he'd invited anyone into his home. The farmhouse had been a solitary refuge for so many years that the thought of overnight guests felt strangely intrusive. Yet as he led the way, Ruby drowsily leaning on her mother, Curtis felt an unexpected relief at breaking his isolation. The spare room was dusty, but clean, with a double bed that had remained undisturbed since Joe's last visit over 20 years ago. Curtis quickly changed the linens while Meredith woke Ruby enough to get her settled. "The bathroom's down the hall," Curtis explained awkwardly. "There are clean towels in the cabinet." "This is very kind of you," Meredith said, looking around the room. Her eyes lingered on a framed photograph on the dresser. 2 young men in veterinary scrubs, arms slung around each, others' shoulders grinning widely. Curtis and Joe in happier days. Curtis followed her gaze. "My brother," he said simply. "He was a vet too." "Was?" Meredith asked gently. Curtis nodded, not elaborating. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything." He retreated before Meredith could respond. Returning to Dakota's side, the horse was stable, his breathing even. The leg properly elevated, Curtis settled onto the cot, intending to rest briefly, but the emotional and physical toll of the day caught up with him, and he fell into a deep sleep. Dreams came, as they often did, of Joe, but for the first time in years they weren't nightmares of the accident. Instead, Curtis dreamed of their early days as veterinarians, working side by side, saving animals others had given up on. He dreamed of Joe's laugh, his unwavering confidence, his ability to see the best in everyone, including his older brother. Curtis woke just before dawn to find Ruby sitting beside Dakota's stall, her small hand resting gently on the horse's neck. She looked up as Curtis stirred. "He's breathing better," she observed. Not as shallow as before. Curtis checked Dakota's vitals, impressed by the girl's observation. "You're right, his oxygen levels are improving. Is that good?" "Very good. It means he's responding well to the treatment so far," Ruby beamed, then grew serious. "Mr. Malone, was that your brother in the picture upstairs?" Curtis nodded, busying himself with checking Dakota's bandages. "What happened to him?" Curtis's hands. Still, the question was direct, as children's questions often were, cutting through the protective layers adults built around painful truths. "He died," Curtis said finally, "during a procedure we were performing together." Ruby absorbed this. "Was it your fault?" The question hit like a physical blow. It was the same question Curtis had asked himself thousands of times over the years. "I was the senior veterinarian," he replied carefully. "I was responsible, but was it your fault?" Ruby persisted. Did you make a mistake? Curtis looked at this child so earnest and direct and found himself answering with honesty. He rarely allowed himself. No, I followed every protocol. Did everything right, but sometimes, Ruby, things go wrong anyway. Then why did you stop being a vet? Curtis looked at Dakota, the sophisticated bracing system holding the horse's broken leg together. Me, because I couldn't forgive myself for not being able to save him. Ruby placed her small hand on Curtis's arm. I'm glad you're helping Dakota. I think your brother would be glad too. The simple statement delivered with a child's pure conviction resonated with Curtis in a way no adult consolation ever had. Before he could respond, Dakota nickered softly, beginning to stir from the sedation. He's waking up, Ruby said excitedly. Curtis nodded, pushing aside the emotional moment to focus on his patient. This is the tricky part. He can't panic when he becomes aware of the brace. It could damage the repair we've done. Ruby immediately positioned herself where Dakota could see her, speaking in the soothing tone that seemed to calm the horse. It's okay, boy. You're okay. Mr. Malone fixed your leg. You just have to be still now. To Curtis's amazement, Dakota remained calm as consciousness returned. The horse's eyes found Ruby first, then tracked to Curtis, then down to the strange apparatus encasing his leg. There was confusion but no panic. Remarkable. Curtis murmured his trust in you. Ice extraordinary. Meredith joined them, bringing coffee and the simple breakfast she'd prepared in Curtis's kitchen as they watched Dakota become more alert. Carefully testing his new limitations, Curtis explained the long recovery ahead. The external fixator needs to stay on for at least 8 weeks, possibly longer. He'll need to remain here where I can monitor him daily. Curtis looked at Meredith apologetically. I know that's not convenient for you and Ruby. We'll make it work, Meredith assured him. Ruby's school is on break for summer, and I can arrange my shifts around visits. She hesitated. Unless having us here would be an imposition. Curtis surprised himself with his response. Not at all. I think Dakota does better with Ruby around, and an extra pair of hands would be helpful. The relief on Ruby's face was immediate. So we'll be partners in taking care of Dakota. Partners? Curtis agreed, the word feeling strange but right on his lips, for as long as it takes to get him back on his feet. What Curtis didn't say, what he barely admitted to himself, was how the previous day had awakened something he'd thought long dead. The satisfaction of using his skills, of making a difference. For the first time in 20 years, he'd acted as a veterinarian again, not just as a farmer with some medical knowledge. As morning light filled the barn, illuminating Dakota and the 2 people who had unexpectedly entered Curtis's solitary existence, he allowed himself to acknowledge a simple truth in trying to save this horse. He might have taken the first step toward saving himself. The next week established a new rhythm in Curtis's once solitary life. Mornings began with checking Dakota's vitals and adjusting his medication. Ruby arrived after breakfast, often staying until evening, reading to the horse and helping with his care. Meredith visited between her shifts at the diner and the local grocery store, bringing food that Curtis reluctantly admitted was better than anything he'd cooked for himself. In years, word of Curtis's return to veterinary work spread through Red Rock like wildfire. Dr. Chapman made daily visits, ostensibly to check on Dakota's progress, but Curtis recognized the professional curiosity in his former mentor's eyes. The complex fixation system was holding well, with no signs of infection, a critical milestone in the recovery process. On the 8th day, while Curtis was adjusting Dakota's medication, Sheriff Sanders' patrol car pulled up outside the barn. The sheriff ambled in, removing his hat as he approached the stall. Quite a setup you've got here, he commented, examining the bracing system with a low whistle. Russell says it's some kind of miracle. Not a miracle, Curtis corrected. Just good medicine and a strong-willed horse. And a stubborn veterinarian, Greg added with a knowing look. He glanced around. Where's your shadow today? Ruby's at her grandmother's. She'll be here this afternoon. Curtis finished administering Dakota's medication. What brings you out here, Greg? Doubt it's just to check on a horse. The sheriff leaned against the stall door, partly the horse, partly professional curiosity about what brought Curtis Malone back from the dead, and partly hesitated to give you a heads up. Curtis's hands stilled. About what? Preston Wellington was asking questions in town yesterday about you and about the Fuller horse. Seem mighty interested in what you're doing out here. A cold knot formed in Curtis's stomach. Wellington hasn't spoken to me in 20 years. Why would he care now? Greg shrugged. Don't know. But when the richest man in the county starts asking questions, it usually means something's brewing. Curtis thought of Wellington's parting words 2 decades earlier. You'll never work with horses in this county again, I'll make sure of it. The threat had proven unnecessary. Curtis had walked away from veterinary practice voluntarily after Joe's death. But Wellington had never been one to forget a grudge. Thanks for the warning, Curtis said, returning his focus to Dakota. Greg lingered, watching Curtis work. You know, seeing you like this brings back memories before the accident. You were the best damn horse vet. In 3 states, that was a long time ago. Maybe not as long as you think. Greg observed, looks tome like you haven't lost your touch after the sheriff left. Curtis found himself unusually restless. The mention of Preston Wellington had disturbed his heart. One equanimity he busied himself with farm chores, trying to push away memories of the last time he'd faced the powerful rancher that afternoon. Ruby arrived with news that lightened Curtis's mood considerably. Dakota stood up by himself this morning, she announced triumphantly, rushing into the barn. When I came in, he was already up. Curtis hurried to the stall where Dakota stood, shakily but definitely upright, his injured leg held carefully off the ground. It was a significant development. Horses needed to stand to maintain circulation and prevent secondary complications like colic or pneumonia. That's excellent, Curtis confirmed, carefully examining the fixation system to ensure the movement hadn't compromised anything. He's ahead of schedule. Ruby beamed, stroking Dakota's neck proudly. I knew he could do it, as Curtis completed his examination. Ruby studied him with unusual intensity. Mr. Malone, can I ask you something? Of course, the kids at school say Mr. Wellington is telling people you're going to make Dakota worse, that you don't really know what you're doing. Why would he say that when he hasn't even seen Dakota? Curtis sighed, wondering how to explain adult vendettas to a 12-year-old Mr. Wellington. And I have history. He doesn't think highly of me because of your brother. Curtis nodded reluctantly. Partly Joe was treating Mr. Wellington's prize stallion. When the accident happened, the horse survived. But Joe didn't. Ruby's brow furrowed in confusion. But if it was an accident, why does he blame you? Sometimes people need someone to blame when bad things happen. Curtis explained, it's easier than accepting that some things are beyond anyone's control. Ruby seemed to consider this as that what you did, blame yourself, because it was easier. The question knocked the wind from Curtis's lungs, from the mouths of babes, he thought. Probably, maybe. So admitted. Maybe so. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Chapman and his daughter Jenny in her early 30s. Jenny had followed her father into veterinary medicine, specializing in equine rehabilitation. She approached Dakota with professional interest, examining the fixation system. Dad wasn't exaggerating, she said, clearly impressed. This is textbook application of the Anderson method, but with modifications I've never seen before. The traditional approach wouldn't work for this specific fracture pattern. Curtis explained. I had to adjust the medial support to accommodate the displaced fragment. Jenny nodded eagerly. It's brilliant. The angle of the lateral pins redistributes the stress while maintaining perfect alignment. She looked at Curtis with undisguised admiration. Would you mind if I documented this for a case study? Their recovery technique could help other horses with similar injuries. Curtis hesitated. Publication meant attention, something he'd deliberately avoided for decades, but the possibility that his approach could help other animals tugged at the part of him that had never stopped being a veterinarian at Hartlett's. See how it turns out. First, he hedged. We're not out of the woods yet, but 3 weeks into Dakota's recovery, it became increasingly clear that the procedure had been a success. The horse was standing for longer periods, the swelling had subsided significantly, and initial X-rays showed promising bone union. Ruby's daily presence seemed to accelerate Dakota's healing. The horse responded to her voice with unmistakable recognition, following her commands with remarkable compliance. Curtis found himself drawn into long discussions with Dr. Chapman and Jenny about Dakota's treatment, falling easily into the technical language he'd once spoken fluently. These conversations awakened memories not of Joe's death, but of the passion they'd shared for veterinary medicine. The hours spent debating approaches and celebrating successful treatments. One evening, after Ruby had gone home and Curtis was preparing Dakota's night medication, He heard an approaching vehicle, thinking it was Meredith arriving for her evening visit. He continued working. It wasn't until he heard multiple car doors slamming that he looked up through the barn door. Curtis saw not Meredith's familiar truck but a gleaming black SUV. His stomach tightened as Preston Wellington stepped out accompanied by his daughter Angela, and what appeared to be a lawyer clutching a briefcase. Curtis steeled himself, stepping outside to meet them before they could enter the barn. Preston, he acknowledged coldly. This is unexpected. Wellington hadn't changed much in 20 years, still tall and imposing with silver hair and the confident bearing of a man accustomed to getting his way. His eyes, however, held the same anger Curtis remembered from their last confrontation. Malone. Wellington replied, his tone equally frigid. I understand you're practicing veterinary medicine again without proper facilities or updated certifications. I'm treating one horse, Curtis clarified, as a favor that involves complex surgical procedures. Wellington countered on property that isn't zoned for veterinary practice. The lawyer beside him nodded. Opening his briefcase, we filed a complaint with the county veterinary board and the zoning commission. Mr. Wellington is concerned about the welfare of the animal and potential violations of professional standards. Curtis felt heat rising in his chest. After 20 years, Wellington was still determined to destroy him. This is private property. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Wellington smiled thinly. We're just delivering official notice of the complaints. The board will be contacting you. His gaze shifted toward the barn. I'm curious to see this miracle you're supposedly performing. The barn is off limits, Curtis said firmly, positioning himself between Wellington and the entrance Angela. Wellington, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Dad, we've delivered the papers, let's go. Something in her tone caught Curtis's attention. Unlike her father, Angela's expression held no malice. If anything, she seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation. Wellington ignored his daughter. You should have stayed retired. Malone, you couldn't save my horse properly 20 years ago, and you can't save this one now. Curtis fought to control his temper. Your horse survived, Preston. Joe didn't, and I didn't make that choice. Wellington's face darkened. My stallion was worth more than Dad. Angela interrupted sharply. That's enough. A tense silence fell, broken by the sound of tires on gravel. Meredith's truck pulled up and Ruby jumped out before it had fully stopped rushing toward the Iban until she saw the gathering. She slowed, approaching cautiously. Mr. Malone? She called uncertainly. Ice everything, okay? Curtis nodded reassuringly. Everything's fine, Ruby. These people were just leaving. Ruby studied Preston Wellington with surprising directness. Are you the man who's saying bad things about Mr. Malone because he's saving Dakota when everyone else wanted to kill him? Wellington seemed taken aback by the child's bluntness before he could respond. Angela knelt to Ruby's level. Is Dakota your horse? How's he doing? He's getting better every day. Ruby replied proudly. Malone says the bone is healing, faster than expected. Want to see? Angela glanced at Curtis, a silent request for permission after a moment's hesitation. Curtis nodded. The veterinary board would visit anyway. There was nothing to hide, just Angela, he specified, not Wellington or the lawyer. Preston began to protest, but Angela cut him off. It's fine, Dad, I'll report back objectively. The emphasis on the last word carried clear meaning between father and daughter as Angela followed Ruby into the barn. Curtis turned to Wellington. Your complaints won't stick. Chapman's been monitoring Dakota's treatment. The procedure is fully documented and follows all professional guidelines. Wellington's jaw tightened. We'll see inside the barn. Ruby proudly showed Angela the healing progress, explaining the treatment with the confidence of a child who had absorbed every detail of Curtis's explanations. Angela examined the fixation system with clear expertise, asking technical questions that revealed her own veterinary background. This is remarkable work, she admitted, turning to Curtis, especially considering the limitations of a field environment. The bone alignment is perfect. Curtis had forgotten that Preston's daughter had become a veterinarian. You practice? He asked Angela, nodded. Equine surgery. At Wellington Stables, I specialize in orthopedics. She hesitated. I've studied your early papers on external fixation techniques. They're still referenced in veterinary school. Curtis felt an odd mixture of pride and discomfort at their revelation. That was a long time ago, but the principles still apply. Angela insisted this adaptation of the Anderson method. It's innovative, possibly, groundbreaking for certain types of fractures. Their conversation was interrupted by Wellington calling, impatiently. From outside, Angela straightened her professional demeanor, returning, "Thank you for allowing me to see him." "Why," she said formally as she headed for the door, she paused. "For what it's worth, I never believed you were responsible for what happened to your brother, neither did any of the other veterinarians who reviewed the case." Before Curtis could respond, she was gone, leaving him with a strange sense that something significant had shifted. Though he couldn't yet identify what after Wellington's party departed, Curtis explained the situation to Meredith. Her concern was immediate. "Can they force you to stop treating Dakota?" she asked worriedly. "Technically, yes," Curtis admitted, "but I don't think they will. The treatment is sound and Chapman's involvement legitimizes it. But why would Wellington do this after all these years?" Curtis sighed heavily. Old grudges die hard, and Preston Wellington has never liked. Losing control as they talked, Ruby continued her evening routine with Dakota. Seemingly unconcerned by the confrontation she'd witnessed, her faith in Curtis remained absolute, a trust he found increasingly difficult to disappoint that night. After Meredith and Ruby left, Curtis sat beside Dakota's stall. Turning the day's events over in his mind, Wellington's threats were troubling. But Angela's reaction had been unexpected. The acknowledgement that his early work was still respected in veterinary circles stirred something within him, a pride he'd long suppressed. Dakota nickered softly. Drawing Curtis from his thoughts, the horse was watching him with an almost human awareness. "What do you think, boy?" Curtis murmured. "Have I been hiding out here too long?" The horse nudged Curtis's hand gently as if offering his opinion. Curtis found himself smiling despite the day's tension. For 20 years, he'd constructed a life designed to minimize risk, emotional and professional. Yet here he was fighting for a horse everyone else had given up on, allowing people back into his life and facing down old adversaries. He didn't know what Wellington's next move would be. But for the first time in decades, Curtis felt ready to face whatever came, not just for Dakota's sake, but perhaps for his own as well. The veterinary board inspection arrived 3 days later in the form of 2 officials from the state capitol. Curtis had prepared, meticulously gathering all documentation of Dakota's treatment, including Dr. Chapman's notes and the daily progress logs Ruby had surprisingly maintained with impressive detail. The inspector spent hours examining Dakota, reviewing the treatment protocol, and questioning Curtis about his methodology. To Curtis's relief, they seemed more interested in the medical aspects than the zoning complaints. By the end of their visit, the senior inspector, a woman in her 50s with decades of experience, pulled Curtis aside. "Between us, Dr. Malone, this complaint is politically motivated, not medically justified," she confided. "Your treatment plan is sound, your documentation impeccable, and the horse is clearly thriving under your care. The board won't interfere." Curtis felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "Thank you, one more thing," she added, glancing toward the barn where Ruby was reading to Dakota. "That modification to the Anderson method, the adjustable tension system you've developed for the medial support, have you published it?" Curtis shook his head. "It's just something I worked out for this specific case. You should consider documenting it. Innovations like that could help a lot of horses." She handed him a business card. "When you're ready, send it to me. Our journal would be interested." After the inspectors left, Ruby bounced with excitement. "They liked what you did. They said Dakota is getting better because of you." Curtis smiled at her. "Enthusiasm, they did, and he is, but remember, he's still got a long way to go, but he'll make it." Ruby insisted. "I know he will." The certainty in her voice was contagious. Curtis found himself nodding. "I believe you're right." As weeks turned into months, Dakota's recovery progressed steadily. The fracture began to unite, callus formation visible on X-rays. 6 weeks after the procedure, Curtis carefully removed 2 of the external pins, beginning the gradual process of reducing the fixation system as the bones strengthened. Throughout this time, Curtis's isolated farm had transformed into a hub of activity. Dr. Chapman and Jenny visited regularly, often bringing veterinary students eager to observe the groundbreaking treatment. Sheriff Sanders stopped by with increasing frequency, bringing news from town and staying for coffee. Even old Mrs. Miller from the feed store delivered supplies personally, now always with freshly baked goods and the latest town gossip. Most significantly, Meredith and Ruby had become fixtures in Curtis's daily life. What had begun as necessary visits for Dakota's care had evolved into something that felt remarkably like friendship, or perhaps even more, though Curtis was careful not to examine those feelings too closely one evening. In late summer, as Curtis and Meredith sat on the porch, watching Ruby lead Dakota in a slow, careful walk around the paddock, Curtis finally asked the question that had been on his mind. What happens when he's fully recovered, when he doesn't need to stay here anymore? Meredith's gaze remained on her daughter and the horse. I've been wondering that myself. She turned to face Curtis. Ruby will be heartbroken to stop coming here. She talks about you constantly, about everything you've taught her. Curtis felt a tightness in his chest. The visits don't have to stop just because Dakota is better, don't they? Meredith asked softly. You've lived alone for 20 years, Curtis. Will you really want us disrupting your peace once Dakota's gone? Before Curtis could answer, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. A sleek black car pulled up, the driveway similar to Wellington's but smaller to Curtis's surprise. Angela. Wellington stepped out alone. Curtis tensed, expecting more legal threats, but Angela's expression was open, even eager. As she approached Dr. Malone, she called, I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to see Dakota's progress. She noticed Meredith and Ruby in the paddock and waved, and to speak with you privately if possible. Curtis introduced Angela to Meredith, who excused herself to join Ruby with Dakota once they were alone. Angela got straight to the point. The veterinary board dismissed my father's complaint, completely rejected it based on the inspector's report. She smiled slightly. He's not taking it well. Curtis studied her curiously. You don't seem too disappointed. I'm not, Angela admitted. What you've done with Dakota is remarkable. It deserves recognition, not punishment. She hesitated. That's actually why I'm here. I have a proposal for you. Curtis raised an eyebrow, wary but intrigued. I've been tracking Dakota's case through the board reports. Angela explained. The modified Anderson method you've developed could revolutionize treatment for certain types of equine fractures. We have 3 cases at Wellington Stables right now that could benefit from your approach. Wellington Stables. Curtis repeated, the irony not lost on him. Your father would never allow me near his horses. Angela's expression hardened slightly. It's not just his stable anymore. I'm the chief veterinary surgeon now, and I make the medical decisions. She looked away briefly. My father and I have different perspectives on many things, including what happened 20 years ago. Curtis was silent, processing this revelation. I'd like you to consult on these cases. Angela continued officially. As a paid veterinary consultant, the offer landed like a bombshell. 20 years of self-imposed exile, and now an invitation to return to the very place that had been the epicenter of his professional destruction. Why? Curtis asked finally. Why no after all this time? Angela's answer was simple. Because Dakota is walking, when all conventional wisdom said he should be dead. Because the techniques you're using could help other horses. And because, she added more softly, it's time to correct an old injustice. Curtis glanced toward the paddock where Ruby was now showing Dakota to Angela's assistant, who had remained with the car. I don't know, he said honestly. There's a lot of history there. Just think about it. Angela urged, visit the stable, see the cases. No commitment. After Angela left, Curtis joined Meredith and Ruby in the paddock. Dakota's progress was evident in his confident steps, the injured leg bearing more weight each day. What did she want? Meredith asked quietly, while Ruby led Dakota to the water trough. Curtis explained Angela's proposal, still somewhat stunned by it himself. It would mean going back to Wellington Stables facing Preston. Meredith studied his face. And is that something you want to do? I don't know, Curtis admitted. For 20 years I've defined myself by what happened there, by what he lost. He watched Dakota drink the horse's recovery, a living testament to what was still possible, but maybe it's time to redefine myself by what I can still do for what it's worth. Meredith said softly, the man who saved Dakota isn't defined by his past. He's defined by his courage to try when everyone else had given up. Her words stayed with Curtis through the evening and into the night. After Meredith and Ruby left, he sat beside Dakota's stall, the horse now comfortable enough to lie down for longer periods. What do you think, boy? Curtis murmured. Ready to share your doctor with other horses? Dakota nickered softly, nudging Curtis's hand with his nose, the simple gesture of trust from an animal who had every reason to fear humans, moved something deep within Curtis Dakota had overcome. His injury, not just through medical intervention, but through courage and the willingness to trust again. Perhaps Curtis thought it was time to follow the horse's example the next morning. Curtis called Angela and agreed to visit Wellington stables. The decision felt momentous, a step back into a world he'd deliberately abandoned, but also, potentially a step forward into a future he hadn't allowed himself to imagine when he told Ruby about the consultation opportunity. Her reaction surprised him. "Does this mean you'll be a real vet again, not just for Dakota, maybe?" Curtis admitted, "I'm just going to look at some cases." Ruby's face lit up. "I knew it. I told Mom you were too good to just fix tractors forever." Her unbridled confidence warmed something in Curtis that had been cold for too long. "We'll see. The important thing is that Dakota continues to improve." "He will," Ruby said with absolute certainty, "and so will you." The day of Curtis's visit to Wellington stables dawned clear and bright. He dressed in his one decent shirt and jeans, feeling oddly formal after years of farm clothes Meredith had offered, to drive him, sensing his anxiety about returning to the place that held so many difficult memories. As they approached the imposing gates of Wellington stables, Curtis felt his chest tighten. The sprawling property was even more impressive than he remembered. Manicured pastures stretching to the horizon, state-of-the-art facilities gleaming in the morning sun. This was the kingdom Preston Wellington had built, the place where Curtis's career had ended and his brother had died. Angela met them at the main equine hospital, a modern facility that hadn't existed 20 years ago. "Thank you for coming," she said, noting Curtis's tense posture. "Dad's in Lexington today. It's just the medical team." Curtis nodded, relieved and slightly ashamed of that relief. As Angela led them through the facility, introducing Curtis to staff members, he was struck by the respect in their greetings. Word of Dakota's treatment had clearly spread through professional circles. The 3 cases Angela presented were all complex fractures that conventional treatment had failed to improve. As Curtis examined each horse, the old diagnostic instincts flooded back his hands, moving with confident precision, identifying problems and possibilities the younger veterinarians had missed by the 3rd case. Curtis found himself sketching modifications to his Dakota technique, explaining the adjustments needed for this particular fracture pattern. The younger vets gathered around, asking questions with genuine interest rather than skepticism. When they broke for lunch, Curtis stepped outside for some air, overwhelmed by the morning's intensity. Meredith joined him, handing him a bottle of water. "You're a natural teacher," she observed. "Those young vets were hanging on your every word." Curtis shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise, "just sharing experience." "It's more than that," Meredith insisted. "When you're talking about veterinary medicine, you come alive. It's like watching someone finally speak their native language after years in a foreign country." The analogy struck Curtis deeply. Veterinary medicine had been his native language affluency. He'd deliberately silenced for 2 decades. Today he'd spoken it again, and it had felt like coming home. As they prepared to leave that afternoon, Angela walked them to their car. "Well," she asked, "what do you think? Will you consult on these cases?" Curtis looked back at the imposing facility, then at the hopeful faces of the staff waiting for his answer. "Yes," he said finally, "I'll help with the treatment plans, but there's a condition." "Name it." Angela replied immediately. "I want to bring a student with me, someone with natural talent who deserves the opportunity to learn." Angela looked confused until Curtis nodded toward the car where Ruby sat waiting, petting one of the stable cats. "The girl. But she's just a child. She's 12. Curtis confirmed, "and she has the best instincts with animals I've ever seen, better than mine at twice her age." Angela's expression shifted from surprise to thoughtful consideration. "We've never had someone that young in our internship program, but if you're willing to supervise, I am," Curtis said firmly. As they drove home, Curtis explained the arrangement to Ruby, whose excitement filled the car. "You mean I get to help other horses like Dakota learn to be a real vet someday?" "It's a starting point," Curtis cautioned. "There's a lot to learn, but you'll teach me," Ruby stated with complete confidence. "Like you've been teaching me with Dakota." The girl's faith in him was humbling. Curtis glanced at Meredith, who was watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and something else, perhaps concern about getting too attached to this new future that felt suddenly possible that evening. After saying goodbye to Meredith and Ruby, Curtis returned to Dakota's stall. The horse was standing comfortably, the healing in his leg progressing exactly. As hoped, in another month, Curtis would remove the external fixation system completely a few months after. That Dakota might even be sound enough for light riding. Looks like we're both healing, Curtis murmured to the horse. Just took us a while to find the right treatment. As he sat on his porch that night, watching the stars emerge over his farm, Curtis allowed himself to imagine a different future than the isolated existence he'd accepted for so long, a future that included not just veterinary work, but people, Meredith, Ruby, and the community he'd kept at arm's length for decades. It wouldn't be easy. Preston Wellington's hostility remained a real obstacle. The memories of Joe's death wouldn't simply disappear, but for the first time in 20 years, Curtis felt ready to move forward rather than merely existing in the shadow of the past. The unexpected gift of Dakota's case wasn't just the professional redemption it offered, but the chance to reconnect with the world Curtis had abandoned, and perhaps, finally, to forgive himself. 2 months after Curtis began consulting at Wellington Stables, the day arrived to remove Dakota's external fixation system completely. The procedure was far less complex than the initial installation, but still required precision and care. Curtis had prepared the barn meticulously, aware of the significance of this milestone. Ruby arrived early, too excited to sleep. She'd confessed she'd been assisting Curtis with his cases at Wellington Stables, twice weekly, absorbing information with remarkable speed and showing an intuitive understanding of horse behavior that impressed even the veteran staff. "Will it hurt him?" Ruby asked as Curtis laid out his instruments. "He'll be sedated," Curtis explained. "There might be some discomfort afterward as he adjusts to full weight bearing, but nothing major." Meredith arrived just as Curtis was administering the sedative-bearing coffee and her now customary basket of muffins. Over the months, her presence had become something Curtis looked forward to with increasing warmth. Their conversation flowed naturally, now unmarked by the awkwardness of their early encounters. "Big day," she remarked, handing Curtis a mug. "If all goes well." Curtis nodded. Dakota could be back to light exercise within a few weeks. As Dakota drifted into sedation, Ruby stroked his neck, murmuring reassurances. Curtis had taught her the importance of keeping horses calm before procedures, and she'd taken to the role naturally, watching her. Curtis felt an unexpected swell of pride in her growth, certainly, but also in himself for having something valuable to teach. Again, the procedure went smoothly. One by one, Curtis removed the pins and supports that had held Dakota's leg in perfect alignment for nearly 4 months. The bone had healed remarkably well, the X-rays showing solid union across all fracture lines. "Is that it?" Ruby asked as Curtis removed the final component. "It looks normal now." "That's the goal." Curtis smiled like it never happened. He ran his hand gently along Dakota's leg, feeling the slight thickening where the bone had healed. He'll always have a reminder, but it shouldn't limit him. As Dakota slowly woke from sedation, they watched, anxiously, for his first attempt to put weight on the newly liberated leg. The horse stood cautiously, testing each leg before gradually shifting weight to the healed limb. He flinched slightly, then relaxed as he discovered it could indeed support him. "He's doing it," Ruby exclaimed, her face radiant with joy. "He's standing on all 4 legs." Curtis nodded, satisfaction warming his chest. "It worked. The bones healed exactly as we hoped." "You did it," Meredith said softly, her hand finding Curtis's arm. "Oh, when everyone else said it was impossible." Curtis shook his head. "We did it. You and Ruby were as much a part of this as I was." The moment was interrupted by the sound of a vehicle approaching through the barn door. Curtis saw Angela Wellington's car pull up, followed by a larger black SUV he immediately recognized as Preston Wellington's. Curtis tensed. Wellington had deliberately avoided crossing paths with Curtis during his consultations at the stables, maintaining his grudge from a distance. His presence here at Curtis's farm was unexpected and concerning. "Stay with Dakota," Curtis instructed Ruby before stepping outside to meet the visitors. Angela emerged from her car first, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry, Curtis." He insisted on coming. When I mentioned today was the removal day before Curtis could respond. Preston Wellington stepped from his SUV, his imposing frame straight. Despite his 70 years, his expression was unreadable, as he regarded Curtis Wellington. Curtis, acknowledged stiffly. This is unexpected. Malone Wellington's tone was equally cold. My daughter speaks highly of your work, says you've revolutionized fracture treatment at my stables. I've consulted on some cases. Yes. Wellington's gaze shifted to the barn and this horse that started it all. He's recovered. We just removed the fixation system. The bone has healed completely. A complex emotion flickered across Wellington's face. I'd like to see it. Curtis hesitated, reluctant to allow Wellington into Dakota's space. But Angela nodded encouragingly, and Curtis reluctantly led the way into the barn inside. Ruby stood protectively beside Dakota, who was now moving cautiously around the stall, testing his leg. Meredith positioned herself between the horse and the visitors, her protective instinct evident. Wellington observed Dakota with a horseman's practiced eye, noting his movement, the line of the healed leg, the horse's overall condition. Remarkable, he said finally, the admission seeming to cost him effort, the same fracture pattern that ended Mustang's racing career 20 years ago. Different circumstances, Curtis pointed out, different techniques available now. Yes, techniques you developed. Wellington countered, surprising Curtis with his knowledge. Angela showed me your notes, the modifications you made to the Anderson method. They're being implemented on 3 of my most valuable horses. Successfully. Curtis wasn't sure how to respond to this unexpected acknowledgement. Ruby filled the silence, stepping forward with the confidence she'd gained over the months Dakota was going to be put down, she stated, looking directly at Wellington. Everyone said he couldn't be saved, but Mr. Malone didn't give up on him. Wellington's expressions softened slightly as he regarded the child. No, he didn't. That's becoming clear. He turned to Curtis, his demeanor shifting. I've been reviewing the records from 20 years ago. Joe's notes from that day. Curtis stiffened. Joe's notes. Wellington nodded. Angela found them in the archives. Detailed observations about the stallion's condition, the complications that arose during treatment. He paused, and his decision to administer the medication that ultimately caused his reaction against your recommendation. Their revelation hit Curtis like a physical blow. For 20 years, he'd carried the weight of Joe's death, believing he should have prevented his brother from taking that risk. To hear that Joe had documented his own decision, explicitly noting Curtis's objection, was staggering. You didn't. No. Wellington realized, studying Curtis's expression. You never read his notes. Curtis shook his head. I couldn't after the review board cleared me. I walked away from everything. Wellington's jaw tightened. I blamed you because it was easier than accepting that sometimes, even with the best care, things go wrong. I needed someone to hold responsible. The admission clearly didn't come easily. Was wrong. The simple statement, I was wrong, seemed to hang in the air between them. Curtis had imagined confronting Wellington countless times over the years, but had never envisioned this outcome. After a moment, Wellington continued, his tone businesslike. Again, Angela tells me you've agreed to consult on difficult cases. I'd like to formalize that arrangement. Make you head of our equine surgical department. Curtis blinked. Surprise, what? The position has been vacant since Dr. Reynolds retired. We need someone with your expertise and innovation. Wellington glanced at Dakota, someone who sees possibilities where others see only limitations. The offer was so unexpected that Curtis found himself speechless. Angela stepped forward, filling the gap. We've discussed it extensively. She explained. The board unanimously approved the recommendation. It would be a part-time position, initially allowing you to maintain your practice here. My practice here. Curtis repeated the words, feeling strange on his tongue. He hadn't thought of his farm as a veterinary practice in decades, yet somehow without his realizing that's what it had become again. Wellington extended his hand, a gesture so unexpected that Curtis stared at it momentarily before accepting the handshake. Think about it, Malone. The offer stands. After the Wellingtons departed, Curtis remained in the barn processing what had just occurred. The vindication he'd unconsciously sought for 20 years had arrived. Yet it felt different than he'd imagined. Less triumphant, more sobering. Joe's notes confirmed what part of him had always known. His brother had made his own choice that day, a professional judgment call that had tragic consequences. What did Mr. Wellington mean about Joe's notes? Ruby asked her perceptiveness, once again cutting to the heart of the matter. Curtis sat on a hay bale gathering, his thoughts. My brother died trying an experimental treatment on Wellington's horse. For 20 years I believed I should have stopped him, that I'd failed to protect him. He looked up at Ruby and Meredith, but apparently Joe knew the risks he documented, that I advised against it, but he decided to try anyway because he thought he could save the horse. Ruby reasoned, yes. Curtis nodded. Heelways, believed he could save them all. Like you. With Dakota. Ruby said simply. The parallel struck Curtis forcefully. In saving Dakota, he'd unconsciously followed his brother's example, taking a calculated risk when conventional wisdom, said to give up the realization, brought not pain, but an unexpected sense of completion, as if a broken circuit had finally been reconnected. Meredith approached, placing her hand on his shoulder. What are you thinking about Wellington's offer? Curtis looked up at her, then at Ruby, then at Dakota, now resting comfortably in his stall. I'm thinking that maybe it's time to stop hiding from what I was meant to do, being a veterinarian, being the vet Joe believed I could be. Curtis corrected, someone who doesn't give up, who finds solutions. Others miss someone who trains the next generation. He glanced meaningfully at Ruby, who beamed at the implication. As evening fell, Curtis walked Meredith and Ruby to their truck. There was a new ease between them, now a sense of shared accomplishment and possibility. When will Dakota be able to come home? Ruby asked a question Curtis had been expecting but dreading. Another few weeks of rehabilitation, Curtis answered. Then he should be sound enough for the trip. Ruby looked crestfallen. But we'll still come visit you, right? Even when he's gone, Curtis felt Meredith's gaze on him, awaiting his response. The months of their daily presence had transformed his solitary existence in ways he was only beginning to fully appreciate. Actually, he said slowly, I was thinking Dakota might benefit from continued monitoring, perhaps a few days, a week here, a few days at your place. He met Meredith's eyes. If that works for everyone. The relief and warmth in Meredith's smile told him everything he needed to know. I think that could be arranged, she said softly. As their truck disappeared down the driveway, Curtis returned. To Dakota, who nickered in greeting. Well, boy, he murmured, stroking the horse's neck. Looks like neither of us is going to be alone anymore. Dakota bumped his nose against Curtis's chest in what felt remarkably like agreement. And for the first time in 20 years, Curtis allowed himself to believe that the best parts of his life might still lie ahead. 4 days after removing Dakota's fixation, System Curtis sat in Wellington Stable's conference room, reviewing the contract before him. The terms were generous, a part-time position as head of equine surgery with flexible hours, allowing him to maintain his farm practice and mentor Ruby through a formalized youth program Angela had developed specifically for her. Everything to your satisfaction? Angela asked, noting his thoughtful expression. The terms are more than fair, Curtis acknowledged. I'm just having second thoughts, Angela replied. Curtis, hook his head, not second thoughts, more like adjusting to how quickly life can change. 6 months ago I was a recluse, fixing tractors. Now I'm considering heading a surgical department at the very place I swore never to return. To Angela smiled. Life has a way of bringing us full circle when we least expect it. After signing the contract, Curtis found himself drawn to a part of the stables he'd been deliberately avoiding, the surgical suite where Joe had died. The room had been completely renovated, modernized, with state-of-the-art equipment, but Curtis could still feel echoes of that tragic day. To his surprise, he found Preston Wellington standing alone in the suite, staring at a small bronze plaque Curtis hadn't noticed before. As Curtis approached, Heckud read the simple inscription in memory of Dr. Joseph Malone, whose dedication to healing continues to inspire. When was this placed here? Curtis asked quietly. Wellington didn't seem startled by Curtis's presence. 10 years ago. Angela's idea, she said. We needed to acknowledge what happened, not erase it. Curtis touched the plaque. Gently, she was right, your brother was brilliant, Wellington said after a moment. Too brilliant. Perhaps he believed he could overcome any obstacle through sheer will and innovation. That was Joe, Curtis agreed, always pushing boundaries, like you with the Fuller horse. Wellington observed, the same willingness to try when conventional wisdom says toss stop. Curtis hadn't considered the parallel before, but Wellington was right in Saving Dakota, he had channeled something of Joe's spirit, the refusal to accept limitations, the determination to find solutions where others saw none. I've signed the contract, Curtis said, changing the subject. I'll start next week after Dakota's follow-up evaluation. Wellington nodded, seemingly satisfied. Angela will handle the announcement to the staff. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. Malone, that young girl. Ruby, she has a gift with horses, reminds me of Angela at that age she does. Curtis agreed. Make sure she gets the education she deserves. Wellington said, the program. Angela's setup is just the beginning when she's ready for veterinary school. Wellington. Stables will provide a full scholarship. The offer stunned Curtis. That's incredibly generous. It's an investment. Wellington corrected, in the future of equine medicine, and perhaps he added with a hint of his old pragmatism in keeping her talents at our stables when she graduates, as Curtis drove home here. Realized that Wellington's offer represented something beyond professional recognition or even personal redemption. It was an investment in continuity, ensuring that the knowledge and skills Curtis had developed wouldn't end with him but would be passed on to a new generation when he arrived at his farm. Curtis was surprised to find Meredith's truck already there, parked beside the barn. Inside, he found her micking out Dakota's stall, while Ruby led the horse in small circles, monitoring his gait. How did it go? Meredith asked, pausing her work. Did you sign? Curtis nodded. Starting next week, I'm officially head of equine surgery at Wellington Stables, part-time. Ruby bounced with excitement. And I get to keep learning from you. More than that, Curtis smiled. Wellington is setting up a formal mentorship program for you, and he hesitated, still processing the magnitude of the offer. He's offering a full scholarship for veterinary school when you're ready. Ruby's eyes widened in disbelief. Really? But that's years away, and it costs so much money. He believes in investing in talent. Curtis explained, and so do I. Meredith leaned against the stall door, her expression a mixture of gratitude and concern. That's life-changing for Ruby. But Curtis, are you sure about all this, going back to Wellington Stables after everything that happened? Curtis considered the question. For 20 years I defined myself by what I lost there. Maybe now it's time to define myself by what I can build there. Instead, he looked at Dakota, now walking with only the slightest hint of his previous injury. Sometimes healing means going back to where the wound happened that evening. Curtis invited Meredith and Ruby to stay for dinner, something that had become increasingly common over the past months. As they sat on the porch afterward, watching the sunset paint the hills in gold and crimson, Ruby's excitement about the mentorship program bubbled over into enthusiastic plans for her future veterinary career. When I'm a real fit, I'll specialize in hard cases, she declared, the ones nobody else wants to try, like Dakota. That's a challenging path, Curtis cautioned, but a worthwhile one. That's why I need to learn everything from you first. Ruby insisted. You know how to fix the unfixable. Curtis smiled at her confidence. I just know how to try when the conventional approaches fail, and how to learn from failure without giving up. Ruby grew serious. Is that why you stopped being a vet before? Because of a failure? You couldn't learn from. Curtis exchanged glances with Meredith, who nodded encouragingly. Over the months, she'd shared pieces of his past with them, but never the full story of that fateful day. In a way, Curtis admitted, when Joe died, I couldn't separate the loss from his profession. Being a veterinarian meant being the person who couldn't save his own brother, so I walked away from all of it. But now you're going back, Ruby pointed out. Now I'm going back. Curtis agreed, because Dakota showed Meth that the joy of healing is still stronger than the pain of loss. After Ruby went inside to call her grandmother with the news about her scholarship, Meredith and Curtis remained on the porch, a comfortable silence. Between them, Wellington also mentioned something else today, Curtis said finally. The possibility of expanding my practice here, modernizing the barn, adding proper exam rooms. He glanced at her. It would mean more stability, a real future here. Meredith studied him in the fading light. Is that what you want, to rebuild your practice here? I'm beginning to think so, Curtis admitted, but I also know it would mean changes. More people around, less solitude. And how do you feel about that? Meredith asked softly. Curtis considered the question carefully. 6 months ago, the idea of disrupting